1606 to 1760. What happened? Quote, "It was evident from the earliest times in America that a sense of exceptionalism existed, that what was being conceived was somehow different, special, and blessed by God." End quote, from Patriots History of the United States. Most of you may know that the first British-American settlement started in around 1606, and only did the American Revolution, begin to show its first signs of revolt in the 1760s. But what happened in between that time to the United States of America, as they were in the precursing area? What happened? Well, that's the question I'm going to answer today in three main ways: their formation, then their establishment, and their early government. Now, first, their formation. The 13 colonies were originally conceived as an attempt for the British to compete both economically and imperialistically with France and Spain, with a New World presence of their own. At the time, France had conquered Quebec more so, and Spanish had taken Florida and Mexico, and they were reaping these massive profits out of the New World, and so the British were trying to do something of their own. They tried in the 1590s with the Roanoke colony, and as most of you know, that mysteriously disappeared. And so it wasn't until 1606 that they tried again with their second attempt, that being Jamestown in Virginia. And that was successful, long story short, and eventually all the other colonies were formed. Now, the way they were established is a little bit different than the way they were formed. They all were formed with the same plan to colonize the New World, but they were established quite differently. In no particular order, the states of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia were formed, Virginia being the first and Georgia being the last. But here's where a big distinction needs to be made. All these states were formed, but there was just a small difference on them, which eventually led to very major things in the United States history. But it all started here. The South, the people who moved to the South, went there to make gobs and gobs of money, live on a plantation, and live the good life. And this good life was just an influx of British culture. So they wanted to live this good life, but the North was different. Quote, "The Pilgrims," the people who colonized the North, "rightly hold a place of high esteem in American history, largely because, unlike the Virginia settlers, the separatists, or the Pilgrims, braved the dangers and uncertainties of the voyage and settlement in the New World solely in the name of their Christian faith." That's what made the northern colonies so different. They didn't have these big plantations. They didn't even really have good land to make tobacco or cotton like the other places did. But what they went there to do was to have religious liberty, to be able to be free to establish their own religion and to do exactly what they pleased to do in their own world. And they were willing to work hard and sacrifice their lives for that, and many did. So that's kind of how these states were made. Maryland was home of the Puritans, and New Jersey went for the Quakers, and Rhode Island was really just a catch-up of all the extremists. But that was how they were formed. And both of these different views of the northern and the southern states led to a very different thing about their early government. Now, around halfway through, when everything was halfway through, was probably the 1730s, everything was okay. People had been settled. Now they're thinking, we gotta find a way to govern ourselves. We can't have a king, because we know that doesn't work. And they were already subject to the king in England. So they had to create their own governments. Now, the North had a very good way of doing this. They created what is called a polis. And a polis is a Greek term for the city-states they used to have there. And what would happen is that there'd be individual little small cities. I mean, Boston was a big city, but you'd have a smaller city. But I'm going to use Boston for an example. Boston would have, the cities would have, first of all, locality. I mean, they would have, everybody in the city would be in the city, everybody would know each other because they grew up together. I mean, there's not a lot of new people coming into the new world, per se. So everybody knew each other. And then everybody also had power. So the power was evenly distributed among every person who could vote, which is all the leading men of the families. So everybody was there, everybody knew each other and respected each other. Everybody had a little bit of power, so there wasn't one person holding too much power. And everybody had robust representation, meaning they all were able to have a say in the affairs governing the city-state. That was happening for every little city-state. Like, you go to the next town and they'd have their own little government. You've got to be a member of the town, really. But they were all close together, so that worked. The South, on the other hand, was much different. They had little to no cities or states, and just they just had plantations. That's the word. And that led to people who were owning plantations just being pretty much the boss of the land. It was big areas that they were being in control of, and that created what was more like an aristocracy than anything else. Now, those differences, just putting the South putting their economy over their demography, and the North putting the demography over the economy, that small difference eventually led to such great things in the nation meaning like the Civil War. The Civil War stemmed off of this small difference began originally. And so, in conclusion, the states were created, and though it may look similar, they were actually quite different. And it goes to lesson to all of us that the little choices we make can actually change a lot about our lives.